Deep in the heart of a cursed forest, a mother's past comes back to haunt her literally. When Amara left her blind daughter to die, she thought she had buried her secret forever. But secrets don't stay buried ... And now something unnatural is waiting in the shadows, calling her name. Stay with me till the end, because this chilling tale will make you question if the dead ever truly rest. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the distant hoots of an owl and the rustling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. Amara's hands trembled as she clutched the tiny bundle wrapped in tattered cloth. The baby in her arms whimpered, a soft, helpless sound that struck a chord deep in her chest. Yet she forced herself to take another step forward. The forest loomed ahead, dark and unwelcoming, its towering trees stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The villagers spoke of spirits that roamed these woods, of curses that befell those who dared disturb its slumber. But Amara had no other choice. She looked down at the infant, her daughter, Nya. The child's pale eyes stared blankly ahead, unseeing a mark of her misfortune. A blind child was an ill omen, the elders had whispered. A curse upon any mother who bore one. Amara had tried to ignore their murmurs, had convinced herself that she could raise Nya despite their warnings. But as the days passed, the weight of their words pressed heavier upon her. A blind child would never be able to marry, never contribute to the village. A burden, a disgrace. Tears blurred Amara's vision as she knelt on the damp earth. "Forgive me," she choked, placing Nya gently on a patch of moss. The baby let out a soft cry, waving tiny fingers in the air as if searching for the warmth that had just left her. Amara staggered back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wanted to reach for Nya, to pull her back into her arms, to run away and never look back. But the voices of the village echoed in her mind. It is better this way. Turning on unsteady feet, she fled, the sounds of her own sobs drowned by the wind whispering through the trees. Behind her, the baby's cries pierced the night. And then, silence. The forest remained still after Amara's hurried footsteps faded into the distance. The baby, Nya, lay motionless on the soft earth, her tiny fingers grasping at the empty air. Her cries had quieted into weak whimpers, swallowed by the endless darkness that surrounded her. The night was merciless, and the cold crept into her fragile body like an unseen predator. Somewhere in the distance, a rustling broke the silence. Then came the sound of heavy breathing, followed by the soft crunch of paws against the earth. A pair of glowing yellow eyes emerged from the shadows, then another and another. The wolves had come. The pack approached cautiously, their noses twitching as they caught the scent of the abandoned child. Their leader, a massive black wolf with a scar across his muzzle, stepped forward, his ears perked, his sharp eyes studying the helpless infant. The others circled around, their low growls vibrating in the air. Nya whimpered, her tiny body trembling, but she did not scream. Instead, she reached out, her blind eyes searching for something, anything to hold on to. The black wolf lowered his snout, sniffing her small hands. A flicker of curiosity passed through his golden eyes before he did something unexpected. He lay down beside her. The other wolves hesitated, exchanging wary glances, but one by one, they followed their leader's cue. A smaller female curled her body around Nya, shielding her from the cold wind. Another nudged her gently with its nose, as if testing her strength. By the time the night grew deep, the baby was no longer alone. The wolves had taken her in, and in the heart of the forest, beneath the watchful moon, the child of man became the daughter of the wild. Amara stumbled into the village, just as the first light of dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her feet dragging against the dirt path. She could still hear Nya's cries echoing in her ears, a sound that refused to fade no matter how far she ran. Her small hut stood at the edge of the village, away from prying eyes. As she pushed open the wooden door, she felt the weight of exhaustion crash over her. The silence inside was unbearable. It was the first time in months that the tiny wails of an infant had not filled her nights. She should have felt relief. Instead, a deep, aching emptiness settled in her chest. She collapsed onto the straw mat, covering her ears with her hands. "It is done," she told herself. "She is gone. The elders will not speak ill of me now. The village will not call me cursed." But the words felt hollow, as if she were trying to convince herself of a lie. For days, Amara moved like a ghost, barely speaking, barely eating. When the village women came to ask about the child, she gave them short, practice answers. She was sick, she murmured. The gods took her. Some nodded in sympathy, others whispered behind her back, but none questioned her further. A mother losing her child was a tragedy, but a mother abandoning her child was a sin one she dared not confess. Yet the shadows in her hut seemed darker now, the nights colder, and sometimes when she closed her eyes, she swore she could still hear Nia's soft cries carried by the wind. She told herself it was only guilt, but the forest had other plans. The forest was alive with the sounds of dawn-chirping birds, rustling leaves, and the distant rush of a flowing river. Among the thick undergrowth, a small figure stirred, nestled within the warmth of fur-covered bodies. Nya, though only an infant, had survived the night. The wolves had accepted her as one of their own. The pack's leader, the scarred black Wolf, kept watch over her, his golden eyes filled with something deeper than instinct and unspoken understanding. As days turned to weeks, the wolves cared for the blind child in ways no human ever had. The mother wolf fed her, allowing her to suckle alongside her cubs. The pack moved carefully around her, nudging her with their noses whenever she strayed too far. Though she could not see, Nya learned to listen to feel the vibrations of the earth beneath her tiny hands, to recognize the soft breathing of her protectors. Seasons passed and Nya grew. Her blindness never held her back. She learned to walk, guided by the gentle nudges of her wolf family. Her ears caught the subtlest of sounds, the flutter of an insect's wings, the snapping of a distant twig. She could sense the shift in the wind, the presence of another being before it arrived. The wolves held under the full moon, their haunting cries filling the night sky. Nya sat among them, tilting her face upward as if she, too, could feel the call of the wild within her soul. She was no longer the abandoned daughter of a heartless mother. She was a child of the forest now, but the world beyond the trees had not forgotten her, and soon fate would come searching. The village sat on the edge of the vast forest, its people carrying on with their daily lives, unaware of the secret hidden deep within the trees. But the wind carried whispers, strange stories of a spirit roaming the woods, a creature neither human nor beast. It began with the hunters. One evening, two men ventured into the forest, their bows slung over their shoulders. They followed the tracks of a deer moving silently through the undergrowth. But as they reached a small clearing, a rustling noise made them stop. The air grew unnaturally still. Then they saw her. A girl, no older than 5, stood barefoot on the moss-covered ground. Her hair was long and wild, tangled with leaves. Her skin was pale beneath the faint glow of the setting sun. But what sent chills through their spines were her eyes, milky white, unseeing, yet piercing into their souls. She did not move. She did not speak. The hunters exchanged uneasy glances. "Who is she?" One whispered, "The spirit of the forest." The other murmured, "A child taken by the gods." Before they could take another step, a deep growl rumbled through the air. From the shadows, a pack of wolves emerged, their yellow eyes locked onto the men. The black wolf stood in front of the girl, his stance protective. The hunters did not wait. Panic surged through their veins as they turned and fled, their footsteps pounding against the earth. When they reached the village, breathless and shaken, they spoke of the ghostly child with blind eyes, guarded by wolves. The elders listened in silence, exchanging troubled glances. Deep in her hut, Amara's hands trembled as she heard the tale. The past was not buried. Her daughter was alive, and the forest was keeping her safe. Night had fallen over the village, but sleep refused to come for Amara. She sat on the edge of her straw mat, staring into the darkness of her small hut. The hunter's tale had spread like wildfire, and now the entire village whispered of the spirit child in the forest. But Amara knew the truth. It was not a spirit. It was her child. A shudder ran through her body as she wrapped her arms around herself. She had convinced herself that Nya was gone, taken by the elements or the creatures lurking in the woods. But now the weight of her guilt returned with unbearable force. The wind outside howled like a grieving mother, rattling the wooden walls of her hut. Then, just as Amara began to close her eyes, she heard it. A whisper. At first, it was faint, barely more than a breath carried by the wind. But then it grew clearer, curling around her like invisible fingers. Mama ... Amara's heart stopped. She bolted upright, her breath shallow. Mama, why did you leave me? The voice was soft yet laced with sorrow, drifting through the walls like mist. Amara clamped her hands over her ears, shaking her head violently. This is not real. This is not real. Then, a sudden knock at the door. She jumped, her pulse thundering. No one knocked at this hour. The village slept. No one would dare visit her in the dead of night. Slowly, she stepped forward, her fingers trembling as she reached for the wooden door. She hesitated, then pulled it open. Nothing. Only the empty night, thick with shadows. But as she stepped back inside, a gasp escaped her lips. There, on the floor of her hut, smeared in dirt as if written by an unseen hand, was a single word. Mama. A strangled scream tore from Amara's throat as she stumbled backward. The walls of the hut seemed to close in, the air growing thick with an unseen presence. The past was no longer content to stay buried. Her daughter was calling for her, and this time she would not be ignored. Amara barely slept that night. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the word scrawled on her. Floor Mama. The wind whispered her daughter's voice. Soft but persistent, creeping into her mind like a shadow that refused to leave. By morning, her body felt weak, her hands shaking as she fetched water from the village well. The other women whispered as she passed, their gazes filled with suspicion. She looks haunted, one murmured. She's been cursed, another said. Amara ignored them. The only thing that mattered now was the gnawing fear in her heart. Was Nya truly alive? If so, how had she survived? The hunters had spoken of a ghost child, a blind girl raised by wolves. But how could that be? As she made her way back to her hut, something caught her attention. At the edge of the village, standing just beyond the tree line, was a figure. Amara froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was a child. She was too far to see clearly, but the girl stood unnaturally still, her head tilted slightly. Though Amara could not see the child's eyes, she felt their gaze pierce through her. A cold shiver crawled up her spine. Then, without a sound, the girl turned and disappeared into the forest. Amara's pot of water tumbled from her grasp, splashing onto the dry earth. She barely noticed. Her feet moved on their own, her body pulling her forward. She stepped past the village boundary, past the safety of the familiar paths. The trees swallowed her whole, their branches twisting like grasping hands. The forest had always been forbidden, too dark, to full of secrets. But now it was calling her, and she had no choice but to follow. The forest was unlike anything Amara remembered. It had always been dense, filled with tangled roots and towering trees, but now it felt alive. The air was thick with whispers, the rustling of leaves sounding almost like voices. Every step she took felt as though unseen eyes were watching her, judging her. She moved cautiously, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The girl she had seen, was it truly Nya? Or was it something else? A spirit? A curse? Amara swallowed hard, forcing herself deeper into the woods. The sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting eerie shadows across the ground. Every so often, a twig snapped behind her. But when she turned, there was nothing. Then, a sound, a soft giggle like that of a child. Amara froze. It was distant but unmistakable. Her breath hitched. Nya, she called, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Her hands trembled as she stepped forward, pushing past thick vines. The giggle came again, this time closer. It sent chills down her spine. She stumbled into a small clearing, the earth soft beneath her feet, and then she saw them glowing eyes peering at her from the darkness. Wolves, a dozen of them, their bodies partially hidden in the undergrowth, their golden eyes unblinking. They did not snarl or attack. They only watched. Then, movement. From between the wolves, a small figure emerged. A girl, barefoot and wild-haired, her skin kissed by the sun. Her clothes were nothing more than scraps of fabric, tattered and worn. She moved with unnatural grace, her head tilting slightly as if sensing Amra's presence. But it was her eyes, those pale, unseeing eyes, that made Amra's knees weaken. "Nya," Amara breathed, her voice cracking. The child did not speak. Instead, she lifted a small hand and pointed at Amara. A cold wind swept through the clearing, and the wolves let out a low, unified growl. Amara took a step back, suddenly aware that she was no longer in control. She had come searching for the past, but now the past had found her. Amara's breath hitched as the child's finger remained locked on her. The wind howled through the trees, sending dry leaves spiraling in the air. The wolves, silent but menacing, inched forward, their eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Fear held her in its icy grip. Then Nya spoke. "You left me." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it echoed through the clearing as if the forest itself had repeated it. A shudder ran through Amra's spine. Amra's voice broke. I thought you were gone." The wolves growled in unison, their hackles rising as Nya took a slow step forward. The little girl's expression did not change, but her presence was overwhelming, as though the weight of the entire forest bore down upon Amara. "You left me to die." Amara fell to her knees, tears brimming in her eyes. "I was afraid. I was selfish. The trees creaked, the ground trembling slightly beneath her. Nya did not blink. Her face remained unreadable, but her voice carried a sorrow that seeped into Amra's bones. "You were my mother." Guilt crushed Amra's chest, making it hard to breathe. She reached forward, desperate to touch her daughter, to explain, to beg for forgiveness. But the moment her fingers brushed against Nia's arm, a sharp, burning pain shot through her body. Amara screamed, clutching her wrist. It felt like fire had been branded into her skin. When she looked, a single word was seared into her flesh. "Betrayer." Amara's vision blurred as she gasped in agony. She looked up, but Nya had already turned away, retreating into the shadows of the forest. "No, please," Amara cried, stumbling forward, but the wolves barred her path, their growls deep and threatening. Nia's voice drifted back to her, carried by the wind. "You cannot undo what is done." Then she was gone, and Amara was left, alone in the darkness, with the mark of her sin burned into her flesh. Amara collapsed onto the damp earth, her breath ragged as pain coursed through her wrist. The word betrayer burned like fire against her skin, glowing faintly in the dim light. She clenched her fist, trying to suppress the rising panic. The wolves remained still, their golden eyes locked onto her as though awaiting Nia's next command. But the child was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. Amara forced herself to stand, her knees trembling beneath her. "Nya," she called, desperation thick in her voice. "Please, A low growl silenced her. One of the wolves stepped forward, its lips curled back to reveal gleaming teeth. Amara took a cautious step back, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the wolves turned and melted into the trees, leaving her alone. Silence enveloped the forest, save for the rustling of leaves in the wind. The mark on her wrist pulsed with heat, a cruel reminder of the judgment that had been passed upon her. She needed to leave, now. Turning on shaky legs, she forced herself back toward the village, her mind spinning. Had she truly seen Nya? Was her daughter alive? Or was she something else entirely, something born of the forest's wrath? As she neared the edge of the trees, a familiar voice whispered through the air, "Mama!" Amara froze, a cold dread creeping up her spine. The whisper did not come from behind her. It came from within her own mind. Amara staggered back toward the village, her wrist throbbing with pain. The word betrayer burned into her skin like an eternal scar, a reminder that she had been judged. Every step felt heavier, as though unseen hands were trying to pull her back into the forest. When she finally reached the village, the sky had darkened. A few villagers glanced at her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and fear. She must have looked like a mad woman, her clothes torn, her eyes wide with terror. She rushed into her hut, bolting the door behind her. But the moment she leaned against the wall, a whisper filled the air. "Mama!" Amara spun around. The hut was empty, but the voice had been close too close. She pressed a hand over her mouth, her breath uneven. Then the shadows moved. In the dim light of her lantern, shapes twisted and shifted along the walls. Her own shadow stretched unnaturally long, distorting into something monstrous. And among them, a smaller figure appeared, a child's form, its head tilted in silent accusation. Amara squeezed her eyes shut. No, it's not real. A gust of wind blew through the room, snuffing out the lantern's flame. Darkness swallowed her whole. Then came the giggle, soft, mocking. Amara shuddered, her back pressed against the door. The air had turned ice cold. "You cannot escape me," Nia's voice whispered, her words slithering through the dark. A hand small and cold brushed against Amara's arm. She screamed. Amara's scream echoed through the hut, but no one came to her aid. She clutched her arm, her skin still tingling from the ghostly touch. Heart pounding, she fumbled for the lantern, her fingers trembling as she relit the flame. The moment the fire flickered to life, the shadows snapped back into place. The childlike figure was gone, but the air still carried an unnatural chill. Amara's breathing was ragged, her mind racing. "This is not real," she whispered to herself. "It can't be real." But the pain in her wrist told her otherwise. The word betrayer still burned into her flesh, an undeniable mark of her sin. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. "Amara!" A voice called. It was Mossy, one of the older women in the village. Amara hesitated before unbolting the door. The moment she did, Mossy took one look at her and gasped. "Child, what has happened to you?" the old woman asked, stepping inside. Amara opened her mouth, but how could she explain that her dead daughter had returned? Those shadows whispered her name, that she was being haunted by her own guilt. I'm unwell," she said instead. Mossy studied her carefully, her wrinkled hands tightening around the wooden staff she carried. "There is something dark around you, Amara. The spirits are restless." Amara swallowed. "What do you mean?" The old woman sighed. "The forest never forgets those who wrong their own blood. If the child has returned, she seeks something: justice, revenge, or peace. And you must find out which before it's too late." Amara's stomach churned. Too late? Mossy's eyes darkened. "Before she takes what is owed." The lantern flickered violently, and the whisper came again. "Mama!" Amara's knees buckled. The haunting had only just begun. Amara barely slept that night. Each time she closed her eyes, she heard the whispers, soft, insistent, calling her name from the depths of the darkness. The air inside her hut felt thick, suffocating, as though unseen eyes watched her every move. She sat curled in the corner of her hut, clutching her marked wrist. The word betrayer still burned, but worse than the pain was the dread curling in her stomach. She had hoped the haunting would stop, that Nia's presence was just a cruel trick of her exhausted mind. But now she knows the truth. Her daughter had returned, and she would not rest. A sudden noise jolted her, the sound of feet small and bare padding across the floor. Amara held her breath, her pulse roaring in her ears. Then, the voice. "Mama, why did you leave me?" Amara's blood ran cold. The voice was closer this time, right behind her. With a trembling hand, she grabbed the oil lamp beside her and turned. The dim light cast eerie shadows across the walls. The hut was empty, but just as she exhaled in relief, something changed. The shadows stretched unnaturally, pooling in the corner like living things. A shape emerged, small, frail, with tangled hair and sightless eyes that seemed to bore into Amara's soul. Nya. The girl stood silently, her presence colder than the night air. Amara's throat tightened. Nya. She stammered. The child did not blink. She lifted a hand and pointed at Amara's chest. "You will feel what I felt," she whispered. Before Amara could scream, the flame in her lamp flickered out, plunging the hut into complete darkness. Darkness swallowed the room, thick and suffocating. Amara scrambled backward, pressing herself against the mud wall of her hut, her breathing shallow and rapid. The air was colder now, laced with something unnatural, something angry. Then came the sound, a wheezing breath, ragged, strained, as though it came from someone who had struggled to breathe once before. Amara clenched her hands over her ears. "Leave me alone," she cried, her voice breaking. But the voice came again, close enough that she could feel its chill against her cheek. "Mama, do you know what it's like to be alone? To cry and hear no one coming? To scream and have only the trees listen?" Amara's throat tightened with guilt. The memory of that day leaving Nya behind, walking away as the child wailed for her, seared through her mind. "I was young," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I was afraid." The shadows shifted. Nya's figure flickered in the darkness, her pale eyes unblinking. "I was afraid," the child said, her voice hollow. Suddenly, the air grew heavier, pressing down on Amara like unseen hands. Her chest tightened. She gasped, struggling to breathe, her hands clawing at her throat. It was as if the forest itself was choking her. Panic surged through her. She fell to her knees, her vision blurring as the pressure grew unbearable. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Amara collapsed to the floor, heaving, her lungs burning. The hut was silent again, except for the sound of her own ragged breathing. Through the darkness, Nya's voice whispered one final warning. "Now you understand. But it is not enough." The chill in the room faded, and Amara knew this was only the beginning. The morning light did little to chase away the terror that clung to Amara like a second skin. She stumbled out of her hut, her legs weak, her body drenched in sweat. Her throat still ached from the invisible force that had gripped it the night before. Had it been real? Or was she slowly losing her mind? Villagers gathered near the well, whispering in hushed tones. When they saw Amara, their murmurs grew louder. She could feel their eyes on her, burning with suspicion and fear. "She looks cursed," one woman muttered. "I heard her crying out last night," said another. "Strange things have been happening since she returned from the forest." Amara knew she couldn't afford to let fear paralyze her. She approached the well, her marked wrist hidden beneath the folds of her wrapper. But the moment she reached for the rope to draw water, an older woman, Mama Tenny, slapped her hand away. "You bring darkness with you," Mama Tenny hissed. "We have seen the way you wander, the way the air grows cold when you pass. Evil follows you." "Amara, I am not cursed," Amara said, but her voice wavered. Mama Tenny narrowed her eyes. "Then why do you look haunted? Why do the hunters whisper of a ghost girl in the forest? A blind child raised by wolves?" Amara felt her stomach drop. The villagers stepped back, murmuring among themselves. "Tell us the truth, Amara," one man demanded. "What have you brought upon us?" She swallowed hard. If she admitted the truth, if she told them Nya had returned, they would cast her out, or worse. But if she remained silent, the darkness would keep coming for her, and she wasn't sure she could survive it alone. Amara stood frozen as the murmurs of the villagers swirled around her like a storm. Fear shone in their eyes, but there was something else, anger. The kind of anger that could turn deadly. Before anyone could act, a deep voice cut through the crowd. "Enough!" The village priest, Baba Okon, stepped forward, his long staff thudding against the dry earth. The crowd fell silent. The priest was a man of wisdom, his words carrying weight beyond mere superstition. Baba Okon's sharp gaze settled on Amara. "Come with me, child." Amara hesitated, but refusing him would only worsen her situation. She followed him as he led her toward his shrine, a small hut near the great baobab tree at the village's edge. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning herbs. Masks lined the walls, their hollow eyes staring at her as if they, too, could see her guilt. The priest sat on a woven mat and motioned for her to do the same. "I know what haunts you, Amara," he said, his voice low. Amara's breath caught. You do." Baba Okon nodded. "The spirits whisper of your daughter. They say she has returned from beyond, carrying the weight of your sin." His gaze darkened. "Tell me, child, what did you do?" Tears welled in Amara's eyes. "I abandoned her," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was blind, and I was afraid. I left her in the forest to die." The priest sighed deeply, his expression grave. "A mother's curse is the worst of all." Amara's hands trembled. "What do I do? How do I stop this?" Baba Okon leaned forward. "The dead do not return without reason. Your daughter seeks something. Until you give it to her, she will not rest." Amara's heart pounded. "What does she want?" The priest stared into the flames of a small fire before him. "That only she can tell you. But be warned, Amara, if she seeks vengeance. No prayer, no offering, no plea will save you." A shiver crawled down Amara's spine. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it a chilling whisper. "Mama, I am waiting." The priest's words echoed in Amara's mind long after she left the shrine. Each step she took back to her hut felt heavier, as if unseen hands were dragging her down. Her daughter sought something. But what? Forgiveness. Revenge. As she approached her hut, the whispers of the villagers reached her ears. Their eyes followed her every move, their fear turning into something more dangerous: hatred. Amara pushed open the door and locked it behind her. The air inside was thick, as though the shadows had taken form. She hesitated before stepping further in, her breath shaky. Then she saw it. Scrawled across the dirt floor in deep scratches were words that made her knees buckle. "You must suffer as I did." A sob escaped her lips. "Nya, please," she whispered. "Tell me what to do." The flames in her small lantern flickered violently, as if responding. Then a gust of wind rushed through the room, though the windows were shut. A shape emerged in the dimness, small, frail, yet filled with something, dark and unrelenting. Nya. Her blind eyes bore into Amara as if she could see straight through her soul. "I suffered." The child's voice came, hollow and chilling. "I cried, but you never came." Tears streamed down Amara's face. "I was wrong. I was weak. Please, my child, tell me how to make this right." Nya tilted her head. The silence stretched unbearably. Then she whispered a single word. "Come." A cold dread settled in Amara's bones. "Come where?" She choked out. Nia's lips curled into a ghost of a smile. "To the forest. To the place where you left me." Amara's stomach twisted. She had no choice. Tomorrow night, she would return to the forest, to the place where it all began. The night air was thick with the scent of damp, earth, and decay as Amara stood at the edge of the forest, her heart pounding in her chest. The village behind her was silent, the people resting in their huts, oblivious to the nightmare she was about to walk into. She clutched a small oil lamp in her trembling hands, its flickering flame barely piercing the darkness. The trees loomed before her like silent judges, their twisted branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. A cold breeze slithered through the leaves. "Mama!" The whisper floated through the air, wrapping around Amara like invisible chains. She swallowed hard and stepped forward. The moment her foot touched the forest floor, a suffocating heaviness settled over her. The darkness felt alive, pressing against her skin, watching her every move. With each step, the memories clawed at her mind, Nia's tiny hands grasping at her dress, her tear-filled eyes pleading. The cries that had haunted her dreams for years. She had come to make it right. But what if there was no redemption? The deeper she walked, the more unnatural the forest became. The trees seemed to shift, twisting into grotesque shapes. The silence was deafening. No insects, no animals, only the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then she saw it. The clearing where she had left Nya. The place where she had abandoned her child to the mercy of the wild. But it was no longer just a clearing. Bones littered the ground, some old and brittle, others fresh. The stench of death hung in the air, and in the center of it all stood Nya, the blind girl who had survived. Or something far worse. Her pale eyes gleamed in the darkness, her small frame surrounded by the shadowy figures of wolves. They sat in silence, their golden eyes fixed on Amara. Nya took a slow step forward. "You finally came," she whispered. Amara fell to her knees, her body shaking. "Nya, The wind howled, cutting her off. "You left me here," Nya said, her voice hollow. "Now you must stay." The wolves rose to their feet, their low growls rumbling through the night. Amara's breath caught. Had she walked into her own grave? Amara's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she knelt before her daughter. The wolves prowled closer, their golden eyes reflecting the dim light of her trembling lantern. The clearing felt like a tomb, and she was the offering. Nya stood before her, silent and unmoving, her pale, unseeing eyes locked onto Amara's trembling form. The air grew colder, pressing against Amara's skin like unseen hands. "Nya, please," Amara whispered, her voice barely audible. "I came to make things right." Nya tilted her head slightly, considering. The silence stretched, unbearable and suffocating. Then she spoke. "There is no right," she said, her voice soft but sharp as a blade. "There is only what was done." Tears burned down Amara's cheeks. "I was afraid. I was weak. I thought you wouldn't survive." A low growl rumbled through the pack of wolves. Nya raised her hand, and they fell silent. "But I did," she said simply. "And now you must understand what it means to be left behind." A gust of wind howled through the trees, sending leaves swirling around them. The lantern flickered violently, then extinguished, plunging them into complete darkness. Amara's pulse thundered in her ears. A sharp pain shot through her wrists and ankles. She gasped, realizing too late that unseen forces had bound her limbs to the cold. "Damp earth?" Panic clawed at her chest as she struggled, but the bonds only tightened. "Nya," she cried, "please. I am still your mother." For the first time, Nya's expression shifted. A shadow of something pain, longing, flashed across her face, but it vanished as quickly as it had come. "You were," she whispered, "but you abandoned that title the day you left me." The wolves circled closer, their growls a symphony of judgment. Then Nya raised her small hand and pointed to the darkness beyond the trees. "Now you will know what it means to be forsaken." A force, cold and relentless, began to drag Amara backward into the depths of the forest. She screamed, but the trees swallowed her whole. Amara's screams echoed through the trees, but the forest swallowed them as if it had been waiting for this moment. She thrashed against the unseen force dragging her deeper into the darkness, her nails clawing at the dirt, her body trembling with terror. But it was useless. The forest had claimed her. The air thickened, pressing against her like a suffocating weight. Shadows twisted around her, their whispers slithering into her ears. She abandoned her child. Now she must suffer. Betrayer. She gasped as her body came to a sudden stop. The unseen grip released her, and she collapsed onto the damp earth, coughing and shivering. The scent of rot and decay filled her nose. Slowly, she lifted her head. She was no longer in the clearing. The trees had grown impossibly tall, their trunks twisted into grotesque shapes. The moonlight barely reached through the tangled branches, casting eerie patterns on the ground. Around her, figures moved shadowy, faceless beings, shifting and murmuring in voices that sent chills through her bones. And then she saw her. Nya stood a few feet away, her pale, unseeing eyes glowing softly in the darkness. But she was no longer just a child. The air around her pulsed with an ancient energy, something far older than either of them. "This is where I was left," Nya said, her voice no longer hollow but filled with something vast and unknowable. "This is where I died." Amara shook her head violently. "No, you survived." "You? Did I?" Nya whispered. She took a step forward, and the earth beneath Amara trembled. Or did something else take my place? The shadows behind Nya twisted, their shapes writhing like living nightmares. The wolves, once silent, let out a mournful howl that shook the very trees. Amara's body trembled. "Please, Nya," she sobbed. "What do you want from me?" Nia's expression remained unreadable. "Justice." She raised her small hand, and the shadows surged forward. Amara let out one final scream before the darkness consumed her whole. Then, silence. The wind carried away the last echoes of her voice, and the forest was still once more. In the village, the people awoke to an eerie quiet. They whispered of the cursed woman who had vanished into the night. Some claimed they still heard her cries in the wind. Others swore they saw the outline of a blind girl standing at the forest's edge, waiting for the next soul to be judged. Amara's fate was sealed the moment she abandoned her daughter. But what about you? Do you believe in curses? Or was this just the weight of guilt taking form? This story reminds us that our past always finds a way back to us, one way or another. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more haunting and unforgettable stories. Now, here's a question for you. Do you think Nya was truly a spirit? Or was something even darker at play? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love supernatural tales, stick around, there's plenty more where this came from. Love you all.